Good evening. I'm Wade Clark Roof, Director of the Walter H. Capps Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this lecture. The Capps Center honors the legacy of Walter Capps as teacher, citizen, and public official. We do so in a variety of ways as a nonpartisan, non-sectarian center within a public university. We send interns to Washington, D.C., and this coming year, our first intern to Sacramento, to participate in the democratic process. We have a Capps visiting professor for a portion of the year, each year, who addresses in the Capps seminar a major social and ethical issue of our time. We join with the Capps Foundation in sponsoring an annual invitational conference at La Casa de Maria. We have an extensive website with a forum page devoted to commentary and the exchange of ideas about issues pertinent particularly to California, and a list of interfaith activities in our area. But more than anything else, the Capps Center seeks to engage the community in conversation through lectures and conferences. We are concerned about our life together in a democracy and the role of values and beliefs in shaping our public life. Put simply, the Capps Center is about dialogue, civic life, and our common good. Our speaker this evening is especially qualified to stimulate our thinking along these lines. E.J. Dionne, Jr. is co-director of the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, columnist for the Washington Post, and senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. He's one of the most distinguished commentators on religion and politics in the United States today. Born in 1952, he grew up in Fall River, Massachusetts. Upon graduation with a BA from Harvard University in 1973, he went on to earn a doctorate from Oxford University, where he served as a Rhodes Scholar. He spent 14 years with the New York Times, reporting on state and local government, national politics, and from around the world, including Paris, Rome, and Beirut. The Los Angeles Times praised his coverage of the Vatican as the best in 2 decades. In 1990, Dionne joined the Washington Post as a reporter covering national politics. His best-selling book, Why Americans Hate Politics, was published in 1991. Hailed as a classic in American political history by Newsday, the book anticipated all the major themes of the 1992 presidential campaign. It won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and was a National Book Award nominee. Dionne began his op-ed column for the Post in 1993, and it was syndicated twice weekly in 1996. His second book, They Only Look Dead, Why Progressives Will Dominate the Next Political Era, was published that same year. The New York Times Book Review called it, quote, a luminously intelligent and quietly passionate polemic that deserves to alter the terms of American political debate, end of quote. The Sunday Independent of London in December 1996 listed Dionne as one of the 40 most influential thinkers of our time. In 1997, he was named among the 25 most influential Washington journalists by the National Journal and among the capital city's top 50 journalists by the Washingtonian magazine. In 1998, Dionne edited Community Works, The Revival of Civil Society in America, and in 2000 he co-edited What's God Got to Do with the American Experiment with John J. DiHulio, Jr. He makes frequent appearances as a commentator on politics for National Public Radio, CNN, and NBC's Meet the Press. Aside from these impressive credentials, I can also tell you that he's a very fine and caring human being. I met him this past April in a coffee shop in Washington, D.C., and I recall sharing our life experiences and talking about the things that really matter in human life. This evening, he will address the topic, One Electorate Under God, Religion and American Politics. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming E.J. Dionne.
You know, whenever I get an introduction that generous, I assume that I've shown up at the wrong place and that I've been scrubbed and that my colleague David Broder has decided to take my place. Clark, that was very, very kind of you. He's back there somewhere. Actually, the person who's probably best able to address this topic is Clark Roof. He's done extraordinary work in his life and extraordinary work at the CAP Center. And I was very honored to be asked here because I am a great admirer of the Capps family, and the article in the news press noted that I had gotten to know Laura Capps when she worked in the Clinton White House, and I got to know her right around the time my first child, my son, was born, and you know, I heard her talk about her father in such an extraordinary way, because it was a combination of affection, love, deep respect. And when her dad died, I called Laura and I said that when I met you, you gave me one of my life's ambitions, which is that I pray that my kids feel half as good about me as you feel about your father. And so I am just so honored to be associated with this family in any way, and I'm very, very glad to be here. Also, who could not want to come to Santa Barbara? I met an Episcopal minister tonight, and I said the definition of sin is coming to Santa Barbara and staying less than 24 hours. So I feel terrible about that. The other thing is, I love the last paragraph of the news press story. It said that I would throw it open to questions, as any open-minded liberal should do. And so now I have no choice, and so I promise we're going to have a lot of Q&A at the end of this. I also just want to salute the CAP Center, because this notion of open dialogue, I think, is particularly critical at this time in our public life, because in my own life, I have not sensed quite the kind of polarization in politics that now exists in our country. And I can be pretty passionate and sometimes partisan myself, and I don't want to do that tonight, although I might get there in the Q&A session. But I think that the CAP Center is sort of one of those oases that we need in our politics right now and in our public life, and I think you're very lucky to have it as part of this community. And by the way, I know the new progressive era I predicted will have arrived when people stop laughing at the title of that book that I wrote. There are two things you're not supposed to talk about in polite company, and they are religion and politics. And I think for a variety of reasons, they are the two things I have always liked to talk about most, which I suppose proves I'm not terribly polite. And one of the things I want to do tonight is to break some of the stereotypes that I think are unfair both to religious conservatives and to religious progressives or liberals. And I pray that the spirit of this old Baptist church that we are in might come over me, and I might develop a certain eloquence on the topic, but I hope to help us in some way. I'll begin just with three stories that I like, because they sort of tell us that this issue in our politics has been with us a whole lot longer than simply the religious right, or that some of our recent discussions would have us believe. The first story I actually heard from a Catholic bishop in upstate New York, and he told the story of Mrs. O'Reilly, who was being taken to the polls by her son. And Mrs. O'Reilly was 89 years old and had always voted the straight Democratic ticket. And her son was sort of upwardly mobile, was pretty well off, and he'd started voting for quite a few Republicans. And it kind of drove him crazy that his mother just kept voting the straight Democratic ticket. So, as was their custom on Election Day, he gave his mom a ride to the polls, and he asked her, as he always did, how are you going to vote? And she answered, as she always did, straight Democratic. And the son looked at the mother and said, you know, Mom, if Jesus came back to earth and ran as a Republican, you would vote against him. And Mrs. O'Reilly said, oh, hush, why should he change his party after all these years? Precedes the religious right. Second story is about Huey Long. This is a true story where Huey Long, when he first ran for office, knew that the Catholic vote was an important vote that he needed to get in Louisiana. And so he went all over the Catholic parts of Louisiana, and he would say, look, I grew up a Baptist, but I want you all to know that my grandparents were Catholic, and every Sunday morning I would hitch up my buggy and I would take them to Mass, and I would go to Mass with them and I would take them home. And he told this story all over Catholic Louisiana. It turned out that he probably won the Catholic vote because he promised textbooks to parochial schools, but he did do very well with the Catholic vote. And about a month after the election, an old friend of Huey Long's is having lunch with him, and he said, Huey, that was a great story. You know, I didn't know that your grandparents were Catholic. And Huey Long looked at him and smiled, and he said, hell, I didn't even own a buggy. And the third story is only really religious because of its source, but it is, I think this is the story that anyone who engages in Washington punditry should think about as an act of humility. There's a wonderful man called John Burens. He was head of the Unitarian Universalist Association. He's a minister, and he talked about a friend of his who worked his way through divinity school as a baseball umpire. And a mutual friend, they were sitting around talking and said, that must have been a wonderful thing to do. You must have learned to call them as you see them. And this future pastor-to-be was a very honest person, and he said, actually, I learned to call them whether I saw them or not. And when I heard that story, I said, yep, that's what political reporting is all about. You know, when we talk about religion and politics, we can sort of, I think we resist sometimes the notion that they are connected because of our Jeffersonian tradition in believing in some sort of separation between church and state. But separation between church and state does not mean that religion and politics are separated. They never have been in American history, and they aren't now. I mean, you can just look at poll after poll in election after election. White evangelical Christians are more Republican than white mainline Protestants and white Catholics, who are more Republican than Jews and Hispanics, who are more Republican than African American Christians and non-Christians. A great Jewish scholar, Milton Himmelfarb, was writing about voting, and he once said that Jews have the wealth and status of Episcopalians and vote like Puerto Ricans. And it was empirically a very correct observation. This is part of our political life. It is a great line, isn't it? I've always liked that. Those who attend religious services more than once a week tilt very strongly Republican. Those who never attend religious services tilt strongly Democratic. Those in between, which is the majority of us, constitute the majority of us, the once-a-weekers or the twice-a-monthers or so, are more closely split between the parties. So here, too, the people who attend a little more often tend to be a little more Republican. These kinds of splits along religious lines are not new. In the 19th century, a number of scholars have noted that members of what you might call liturgical churches, Catholics especially, tended to be more Democratic, while those who were members of evangelical churches tended to be more Republican. Anti-Catholicism was a key issue at various moments in our history, with the rise of the Know-Nothing Party in the 1850s, and of course during Al Smith's campaign in 1928 and the John Kennedy-Richard Nixon contest in 1960. And at times, of course, the conflicts in our politics split our own denominations and religious traditions. That's why we have Southern Methodists and Southern Baptists and the other kind who came from the North because of disagreements on slavery during the Civil War. At times, some of these splits were really more about ethnic or tribal loyalties. The Irish faced discrimination when they came to America, at least as much because they were Irish and they were immigrants, as because they were Catholic. And I think that you have to sort of see that a lot of the assumptions we make about who someone is religiously and how that translates into their politics are often sort of brought into question by our own history. We think now, when we hear the term evangelical, of someone who is Southern and conservative, and yet it was evangelicals in the North, evangelical Christians in the North, who were among the most passionate opponents of slavery and leaders of the abolitionist movement. Now, I am no particular supporter of President Bush's, as those of you who may have heard me before or read me know, but there is something interesting about the critique of Bush and his use of religious language. Think of this. Here's our president, president of the land of religious liberty, going out there and making his point by citing St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, and I quote, Ephesians says that we should speak the truth with our neighbors, for we are members of one another, the president said. I believe that. I think that is the single most important political insight or social insight in the Bible, and I think it is what should drive us as we behave together. And then he got to his compassionate God talk. Is my destiny caught up in yours? Are we part of the same family of God? It's not enough to say we are all equal in the eyes of God. We are also connected in the eyes of God. And the president got a big round of applause. Now, does it bother you that our president talks this way? If it does, consider this, that the speech I just quoted was not given by President Bush. It was given at Washington's Metropolitan Baptist Church in December 1997 by a president named William Jefferson Clinton. I told somebody earlier tonight, I was invited to a lovely dinner before I came here, and I told someone of covering Clinton in 1992 when he appeared on a Sunday morning before four different black churches. And first thing about Clinton is he didn't see these things as black churches. He understood the theological differences between Church of God in Christ and AME and Southern Baptist. And his political message was the same at all the churches, but his theology and even some of the biblical quotations were very sensitive. And he was a great preacher. And it happened that day that President Clinton was being subjected to another one of those scandal stories that kept seeming to come up about him. And I went up to his press secretary, Dee Myers, and I said, you know why this is happening to Clinton, don't you? It's because God is punishing him for not pursuing his true vocation, which was as a preacher. Now, Lord knows, I don't have a problem with criticizing George W. Bush, but I think we should stop pretending that Bush's regular invocations of the Almighty make him some sort of strange religious fanatic. In the way Bush speaks of God, Bush is much more typically presidential than he is painted. And that's especially true, I think, of our friends abroad who come from a tradition which is in some significant way more secular than our own, or come from a contemporary reality that is more secular than our own. I think of this passage from the President's State of the Union address. He said, quotes, "The liberty we prize is not America's gift to the world, it is God's gift to humanity. We Americans have faith in ourselves, but not in ourselves alone. We do not claim to know the ways of providence, yet we can trust in them, placing our confidence in the loving God behind all of life and all of history. May He guide us now, and may God continue to bless the United States of America." Now, yes, this passage was classic Bush, but it's not hard to hear those words coming from Clinton or Ronald Reagan or John F. Kennedy, who said that our rights come from the hand of God. Yet it did bother some. Diane Francis, a writer for Canada's National Post, said, and I quote her, "Such America with God on its side language smacks of the type of religiosity and fundamentalism that is at the root of the terrorist conflict in the first place. Such mentality is neither helpful nor accurate, nor does it accurately reflect the views of most Americans." Now, as it happens, it was Thomas Jefferson who said that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Now, I think the sweeping attacks on President Bush's public invocations of religion not only miss the mark, they also crowd out what I see as specific and legitimate concerns about his approach. For example, there is a great argument to be had over whether the president's public priorities bear any relationship to the biblically sanctioned compassion that he loves to talk about. Church-based volunteers are wonderful, God bless them all, but they don't have the resources to meet the needs of the poor in health and housing or childcare. I think a fairer question to ask than whether the president talks about God too much is whether his budget, tilted toward those big tax cuts, match his godly talk. And how strong a challenge can Bush put to his fellow Christians to do more for the poor when he openly relies on appealing to people on religious grounds as part of his political campaigns. So yes, and President Bush gives people the willies when he suggests that he feels a kind of religious calling to this historic moment and to the challenges of terrorism. And here is where he does need to pay some attention to foreign critics. Of course, it is common for Christians to speak of a calling, but that doesn't help the president or the country for the world to think, even unfairly, as I think is the case here, that an American president in the process of waging war on terrorism is inspired by not only by his own utter certainty, but also by God's. But still, I think of all things that are troublesome about President Bush, one of them is not that he likes to speak of God. One even hopes he might pray for a little bit of humility. I want to talk about President Bush a little more in relationship to another political figure, and that is Hillary Rodham Clinton. I want to talk about what did it mean to have two good Methodists on the ballot in the 2000 election. I asked that question because George W. Bush is a Methodist, although his background was elsewhere, and Hillary Rodham Clinton is also a Methodist. Now, they were important for the reasons that are obvious. They are important people, but also because I think they help us understand how a kind of narrow view of the relationship between religion and politics is mistaken. Each of them represented different sides of the Methodist tradition, and in so doing, I think they stood in for different sides of our own national tradition of religious engagement in politics and social reform. Bush represented what you might see as the self-perfecting, self-improving side, the pious and individualistic side of Methodism. Mrs. Clinton represented the social change, social activist, social justice side of Methodism. Now that tension within Methodism, forgive me people who were in this Baptist church, that tension within Methodism is a tension that runs right through our current discourse on the role of religion in public life. On the one hand, there is a concern for the common good that it is embodied in what you might see as an economically progressive or social democratic or New Deal view that emphasizes the social and structural causes of poverty and inequality and the social responsibilities that fall on all of us to heal it. On the other side, there is the view that also sees a communal role in resolving poverty, but often locates that role outside of the government. It highlights the importance of individual personal transformation and conversion as the essential element for curing social ills. Now, in keeping with Bush's version of Methodism, this view, and why not call it compassionate conservatism, this view often sees the causes of poverty in individual shortcomings or failures rather than in social or economic injustice. The emphasis is on drug addicts who must free themselves from dependency, former offenders who must transform their hearts, parents who need to be more loving and responsible toward their children. What we see here, I think, is a communal language put to the service of what is, in the end, a serious but highly individualistic way of solving social problems. Let's take as an example Bush's very strong words about the poor in his inaugural address. He said, and I quote, "In the quiet of the American conscience, we know that deep, persistent poverty is unworthy of our nation's promise. And whatever our views of its cause, we can agree that children at risk are not at fault." Now, so far, he has everyone with him around the table, seated from left to right. And then the president went on to say the following. He said, and I quote, "Abandonment and abuse are not acts of God. They are failures of love, and the proliferation of prisons, however necessary, is no substitute for hope and order in our souls." Now, given President Bush's record on law and order issues, it's moving for him even to bring up the proliferation of prisons as a problem. Yet what's important here, I think, is where he locates the causes of these social difficulties. Abandonment and abuse are the problems of poor children. Hope and order in our souls is the solution for the problems of criminality. Now, there's a lot here that many might agree with, but whatever it is not the old social gospel, and it surely isn't the New Deal or the Great Society. In the case of Mrs. Clinton, on the other hand, we know that her emphasis is elsewhere. "It takes a village to raise a child" was the title of her book. It came from Africa, but it could have well risen out of the social justice tradition in Methodism and in many other faiths. And of course, Mrs. Clinton's view of the village encompasses not just families and churches, but also government itself. She has spoken often about the obligations to universal health care and education and family leave and income supplements and child care, all obligations she believes the government should help meet. Now, I hope you'll forgive me my digression on Methodism, but I think these two traditions within Methodism have a great deal to teach us about our contemporary situation. First, as I said earlier, they teach us to be wary of assuming, as has too often been the case in contemporary politics, that the word religious must always be associated with the words right or conservative. That is a mistake made all across the political spectrum. And I also think it's recalling that the emphasis on self-improvement and self-control that is part of the Bush story was once in our history intimately linked to the cause of social reform itself. The people who ran the settlement houses and led the original progressive movement in our country were concerned with the moral formation of individuals as well as social transformation. You can actually see this in Martin Luther King's speeches as well. Those who favored the prohibition of alcohol, for example, did not see it as an alternative to social reconstruction, but as part of a program of social reconstruction that encompassed reform of economic and governing structures as well as the individual. Self-improvement was linked to the idea of social improvement. You saw this in the early trade union movement, which put heavy emphasis on education itself and self-help. You saw it powerfully in the civil rights movement. In a wonderful book that I commend to you, Radical Equations, Math Literacy and Civil Rights, the legendary civil rights leader Robert Moses captured the magic of that moment in our history. The civil rights movement of the 1960s, he wrote, was less about challenges and protests against white power than feeling our way toward our own power and possibilities, really a series of challenges by ourselves and our communities to ourselves. This was a movement that placed demands on society and on individuals. Now, in speaking with respect, and I do respect it, for the self-improvement and self-denying side of Methodism, and more generally of our American religious traditions, I do not want to pretend to a false piety. I am a Catholic, and anyone who knows me or was with me tonight knows that I have no special sympathy for the cause of prohibition. In fact, I have always thought that Roosevelt and repeal, in the 1932 slogan, was one of the finest slogans in American political history. It was right on both counts. But to understand this current moment, I think it's essential that we confront this new division that has arisen between those who advance the cause of personal moral improvement and those who seek social and economic transformation. Two causes that were once allies are now often face off against each other as adversaries. I'm very fond of a line from the writer Michael Ignatieff in his book, The Needs of Strangers. He wrote, "We need justice, we need liberty, and we need as much solidarity as can be reconciled with justice and liberty." Now, just exactly how we do this, well, nobody ever said this business of democracy was easy, but I think that the current interest in the role of faith in public life, the new engagement of religious groups in our public life, the willingness of politicians from Bush and Lieberman and to Gore and both Clintons to talk about their faith in public, I think all these reflect a new search for a common public moral language that tries to find a plausible route to Ignatieff's objectives. I think it would help our discussions on this subject if we acknowledge that almost all of us can be quite inconsistent in our views of how and when religion should influence politics. Many who welcome the prophetic role of the churches in movements to abolish slavery, promote civil rights, secure social justice, and fight poverty are skeptical of applying religion's prophetic voice to matters such as abortion, sexuality, or family life. Many who welcome this second set of concerns by the churches can be just as wary of crusades rooted in the social gospel. Understood this way, it's less surprising that the Clintons and Gore and Lieberman, no less than George W. Bush, could find themselves comfortable about talking about religion's public role. Matt Spaulding, from the unlikely venue in this context, the Heritage Foundation, has argued that what Gore and Lieberman did in the 2000 campaign was to revive the old social gospel tradition in a more ecumenical way, to be sure, that saw religion as a warrant for social justice. Eyebrows were raised when Joe Lieberman said that the commandment to honor thy father and thy mother was a warrant for Medicare. The social gospelers would not have been so surprised. So is the wall between church and state tumbling down? I don't think so. But I think at this turn, after the turn of the millennium, this may well be remembered as a time when our country renegotiated the relationship between religion and public life, between faith and culture. It's my view that we are at a third stage in our great national debate over religious liberty. The first stage might be seen as a time of white Protestant hegemony, and it lasted well into the 20th century. Now, Protestant hegemony sounds like a terribly big and terrible negative phrase, and I don't mean it that way. As I'll be noting, American Protestantism deserves credit for helping shape our heritage of religious liberty. But it is a fact that Protestantism did much to shape the national character and our nation's identity to the point where American Jews and Catholics and Muslims and Sikhs and atheists are all more than a little bit Protestant. That's something my friends at the Vatican used to note with some frustration about American Catholics when I covered them as a journalist back in the 1980s. Now, our nation drew on this shared Protestant spirit to connect people to one another and to the institutions of their common democracy. If you want to see the highest example of this form of Protestant public discourse, take a look at Lincoln's second inaugural address, which is one of the most powerful presidential speeches in our history. If not everyone shared in the Protestant identity in a theological sense, everyone did more or less identify with the institutions it upheld, and of course it was one of the great virtues of this American Protestantism that it underwrote religious toleration and liberty. It is that commitment to religious liberty that allowed Catholics and Jews and then Muslims and Sikhs and Hindus and many others to settle here and helped unsettle Protestant dominance. Now, this first stage, I think, began to erode first in the 1920s with the Scopes trial and the end of Prohibition, which was arguably the last political project to unite mainline and fundamentalist Protestants. But I think the formal dominance of Protestantism was repealed in the 1960s with, it must be said, the strong support of many moderate and progressive Protestants themselves. Thus began what I see as the second stage. The second stage involved a hard push for separation of church and state, including many of the relevant court decisions, such as the ban on public school prayer. It is no accident, I think, that all this occurred as our country was coming to terms with its historic treatment of minorities. John F. Kennedy's election as president marked the full entry of Roman Catholics into the mainstream of American civic life. The civil rights movement sought to right historic wrongs done to African Americans. The era swept away long-standing barriers to Jews and brought the effective end to restrictive covenants. It led to new movements to defend the rights of immigrants from Latin America, Asia, and the Caribbean. Their numbers became even larger after the liberalization of immigration laws in 1965. All this brought the pervasively white and Protestant ethos in government-financed institutions, including the schools, into question. Now, the third stage of the debate, which we are going through now, I think reflects a concern, and it's a concern that goes beyond the religious right, that the push to reduce Protestant Christianity's role may have had the effect of marginalizing faith's public role altogether. Was the public square becoming not simply neutral, not simply more open, but actually hostile to religion? Now, religious conservatives certainly played a key role in this challenge. They decried the growing secularization of America and engaged in what the sociologist Nathan Glazer has called a defensive offensive. It was meant to restore the consensus on values that existed, or at least they thought they had existed before the 1960s. Now, naturally and reasonably, those dismayed by the religious right saw separation as a bulwark against the growing influence of organizations such as the Christian Coalition and the Moral Majority. The Christian conservatives, it's interesting, did not cast themselves as the majority group in the country. They cast themselves as a beleaguered minority, suffering under the oppression of Washington and Hollywood. In a sense, as Nathan Glazer has written in another context, we are all multiculturalists now. Ralph Reed, the Christian conservative leader, was careful in his choice of words back when he did that instead of being a Republican state chair. He said the Christian right sought a place at the table. He did not propose to take ownership of the table or drive others away from the table. You might argue that the phrase, a place at the table, especially when used by our leader of the religious conservative movement, represents the true triumph of religious pluralism. In sum, the third stage in our debate involves an effort to preserve the great gains in religious liberty that characterize the second stage, and yet also protect religion's free exercise and its role in our culture. I think today's commotion is the product of a vigorous renegotiation of religion's public role. At the heart of the renegotiation is a question raised by Yale Law School professor Stephen Carter in his lovely book, The Culture of Disbelief. Was our nation replacing old prejudices against African Americans and against particular people who held particular religious views with a new prejudice against belief itself? Had religion been so pushed aside as a public matter that we had created what Richard Newhouse called the naked public square? Now, I think the clearest difference between the second stage and the third stage is the sharp contrast between the way John F. Kennedy treated his faith as a public issue in 1960 and how Joe Lieberman treated his in the election of 2000. Both men, of course, broke barriers as representatives of minority religions, as non-Protestants in public life. But John Kennedy made the case for his election on the grounds that his religion was not important at all to his role as a politician. His central assertion, politically necessary at the time, was that if ever his faith came into conflict with the Constitution or the public interest, he would resign. And in truth, few outside the most anti-Catholic quarters, and certainly no one who actually knew Kennedy, believed that this was even remotely possible. Joe Lieberman's approach could not have been more different. He praised God in public. He thanked God for his new public role. He spoke at length about the importance of his faith and about the legitimacy of a politician bringing his or her faith to the public arena. Unlike Kennedy, Lieberman said, "My religion is really, really important to me." He joked that as a result of all this, he became known as Holy Joe, a title he said his mother quite liked and that he didn't like at all. Now notice something else here. In order to win acceptance from Protestants, especially evangelical Protestants, it was absolutely essential that John F. Kennedy play down his faith. But when Joe Lieberman played up his faith and spoke of God, it was said that he was doing so, doing exactly the opposite of what John F. Kennedy did, in order to reassure and win over those very same groups of evangelical Protestants, or perhaps their children and grandchildren. In Kennedy's time, the fear to be addressed was that a politician was not Protestant. In Lieberman's time, the fear that was addressed was that a politician was not religious enough. Thus, a characteristic difference between the second and third stages. Now, I'd like to suggest that the third stage that I've described, an attempt to honor both halves of the First Amendment, its free exercise clause and its non-establishment clause, has already borne some practical fruit. I won't go into great detail here, but there were some fascinating developments in 1995 when the federal government issued guidelines to school administrators that were designed to make clear that while the state cannot impose religion, cannot impose prayers in schools, students cannot be forced to be secular against their own will or silenced in their personal expressions of religion. Individual students could not be stopped from praying. Jewish students could not be barred from wearing yarmulkes. Any kid who wanted to talk about religion on the playground had the right to do so. As President Clinton said at the time, the Constitution does not require children to leave their religion at the schoolhouse door. Another example where the renegotiation worked was in 1997, when the administration created guidelines requiring government supervisors to respect individual expressions of faith by religious employees. Christians, the guidelines said, could keep Bibles on their desks. Muslim women could wear headscarves. Jewish workers should be accommodated as much as possible in scheduling so that they could honor the high holidays. Now, this all may seem like common sense, but I think it reflects an awareness that a desire to preserve religious freedom entails both keeping government out of the way and protecting the free expression of believers. Now, let's pause for a moment to address some objections to this idea that a third stage in our national debate is either necessary or desirable. Those in minority religions and those outside of organized religion altogether can plausibly argue that the idea that religion is marginalized in the United States is absurd on its face. How can you say such a thing of a country that stamps "In God We Trust" on the currency? Among the well-off nations, we are by almost all measures the most religious, judging by our stated beliefs and by our participation in houses of worship. The clergy play a large public role on all sides of our political debate. It would take too much time to list all of the religious lobbies that exist in Washington. And how many countries, it might be asked, have ever had court cases over whether or not prayers should be said before football games? Now, some cynics, no doubt, might suggest that this pointed to the importance not of prayer but of football in our culture. Nonetheless, we are, I think, unique. And apropos that famous Texas football case, it's very important to note that issues of religious liberty are raised quite differently in different contexts, depending on whether there is a substantial or overwhelming local religious minority that might exercise undue power over religious minorities. I think the charitable choice, the idea of giving help to faith-based charities, looks quite different in large and religiously diverse metropolitan areas than in smaller and more religiously homogeneous communities. A prominent constitutional lawyer I know said that when he was in the South in the 50s, he was Catholic in a predominantly Protestant area, and he was free to not to participate in the religious instruction, but somehow or other, week after week, he and his other Catholic friend were assigned to doing all the nasty chores that needed to be done in the classroom while the religious instruction was going on. So yes, those dangers exist. Now the truth is there's a great ambivalence among all of us Americans about these questions. A joint study by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life that I'm part of in the Pew Research Center a few years back asked two questions, and I'll paraphrase them here. The same sample of Americans was asked if they would prefer to have someone who is a person of faith as president. And they were also asked if they thought it wrong for politicians to talk too much about how religious they are. Now, in the same sample, 70% wanted a president with strong religious beliefs, but 50%, meaning a lot of that, 70%, dislike politicians who talk too much about their religiosity. Now you might ask, how are Americans going to know about a politician's religious belief if they don't want him or her to talk about them? But I think that finding is a lovely indicator of the torn mind and conscience of our country when it comes to religion in public life. We respect and admire religion and its influences, and we worry about what can go wrong if its role is too public. And I might add that we worry about politicians who commit the sin of pride by saying how religious they are. This conflict is carried out on a very personal level, too. In his book, Bobos in Paradise, my friend David Brooks popularized the wonderful term flexodoxy to describe our ambivalence. Many Americans want the moral and spiritual certainty of orthodoxy, but being Americans and being of our time, they also want their orthodoxy to be flexible. They want orthodoxy, but without its rules against women or against birth control or whatever it is they happen to be for. Thus, the popularity of flexodoxy. Now, because of this very American embrace of flexodoxy, I am less worried than some about the new engagement of religion in public life. It does seem to me to respond to genuine changes in American life. In its revised form, it reflects the nation's commitment to pluralism, and it reflects, I believe, not just the rise of the religious right, but also the reinvigoration of moderate and progressive religious groups and denominations. Some of the toughest critics of conservative policies toward the poor in Washington come out of the religious community. They come out of the Social Action Center's Center for Reform Judaism. They come out of the Catholic Bishops' Conference. They come out of Jim Wallace's wonderful organization called to Renewal. I think that this commitment to supporting a public role for religion makes sense, not just for people on the religious right. Some years ago, and Clark was kind to mention it, my friend John DiUlio and I edited a book called What's God Got to Do with the American Experiment? And we noted that the question in the title might well provoke two legions to line up against each other. They'd offer sharply differing accounts of the role of God and organized religion in creating and nurturing the American experiment. In one view, it is America's pluralistic and secular constitution that has promoted freedom and diversity and, oddly, the very strength of American religious communities. A state independent of organized religion has been freedom's and religion's finest friend. Was not a central motivation for the creation of free and tolerant institutions a desire to end wars over God and religion? In the other account, freedom itself is rooted in a theistic commitment to the inviolable dignity of the individual human being. This belief arises, as I said earlier, in the Declaration of Independence from the law of nature and nature's God. A belief in God, in fact, can place healthy restraints on the human tendency to deify political systems or individual political strongmen, and it insists that even strongmen are accountable to a higher authority. Now, in truth, these views are not mutually exclusive. Many Americans, for good reasons, hold to both of them. And where religion is concerned, why shouldn't they? Let's be honest with ourselves and each other. Religion can create community, and it can divide communities. It can lead to searing self-criticism, and it can promote a pompous self-satisfaction. It can encourage dissent and conformity, generosity and narrow-mindedness. It can engender both righteous behavior and self-righteousness. Its very best and very worst forms can be inward-looking. Religion's finest hours have been the times when intense belief led to social transformations. Yet some of its darkest days have entailed the translation of intense belief into the ruthless imposition of orthodoxy. But I think that the history of the United States, despite many outbreaks of prejudice and nativism and self-congratulation, is in large part a history of religion's role as a prod to social justice, to inclusion, and to national self-criticism. I'd like to close with two views of religion's public role, suggesting that at its best, it is prophetic and challenging, often dangerous to the powers that be, and friendly to those who are oppressed and heavily burdened. The first is from Michael Walzer's wonderful book, Exodus and Revolution. Now, Walzer argues that the Exodus story has provided Western thought with one of its central themes of oppression and deliverance, of the idea, as he writes, that the door of hope always remains open. We still believe, Walzer writes, or many of us do, what the Exodus first taught about the meaning and possibility of politics and about its proper form. I particularly love his first one, and think about it for a second. First, that wherever you live, it is probably Egypt. Second, that there is a better place, a world more attractive, a promised land. And third, that the way to the land is through the wilderness. There is no way to get from here to there without joining together and marching. And listen to the historian Richard Whiteman Fox. He was reflecting on the work of that great anti-utopian Christian realist Reinhold Niebuhr and the historian Christopher Lasch. Both, Fox said, understood that religion can be seen both as a democratic social power, a capacity to build community, and as a tragic perspective that acknowledges the perennial failings of human beings to make community endure. Religion, he wrote, allows people to grapple with the human mysteries that neither science nor politics can address, but it also provides a force that science and politics can call on in their effort to understand and transform the social world. Fox, I believe, explains why God and questions about God will always be central to the American experiment. He explains, I think, why we are destined to revisit over and over and over again the relationship between religion and our aspirations to pluralism, freedom, and democracy. Only by doing so will we be able to respect the serious moral commitments of believers and unbelievers alike, and only by doing so over and over will we preserve our nation's great achievements, free expression, and religious liberty. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, E.J., for a very provocative and very nuanced lecture on religion and politics.
Those are very polite words, aren't they? Provocative and nuanced.
Well, you want some tough questions?
I appreciate it.
This audience can probably ask some tough questions, and we have a little time for some questions. And the only difficulty is that we don't have a microphone out there other than this one. And if you have a question, you're going to have to speak it very clearly and loudly so we can hear you up here. And then I'll try to repeat the question, and then, of course, he'll answer. That's the division of labor.
Unless I walk through the crowd, Phil Donahue style.
Well,
that works better.
So, yes.
Now, why did you mention the Low Road and Tom DeLay? That was uncharitable.
That wasn't the judgment.
I said this was a tough audience.
Yeah, right. I guess I think one needs to kind of cut these questions in two. There are times, I am basically a liberal, and a lot of my liberal commitments grow out of my own religious commitments. Everything I think about the poor, I know comes from what I was taught as a kid as a Catholic, basically. And so in that sense, analytically, I'm always worried about this discussion because that is true of me, and I suspect it is true of Tom DeLay that certain things he believes that I don't agree with may come from a similar source. So on the one hand, I defend the notion that an individual can draw their religious beliefs, their political beliefs, in whole or in part from their political beliefs from their religious beliefs. But there are two problems, I think, that need to be addressed. One is, in a pluralistic democracy, it cannot be the case that I go out there to you, or Tom DeLay goes out there to you, and says, you got to believe this because my religion says so. I think one of the most disturbing exchanges that President Bush had was in that famous debate when he was asked, who is your favorite political philosopher? And he answered, Jesus Christ. That wasn't the disturbing part of the answer. The disturbing part was later on when President Bush was asked, can you explain this? Can you explain why Jesus is your favorite political philosopher? And what he replied is, and I'm paraphrasing here, because he changed my heart, and if you haven't had that experience, you won't know what it is. Now, I think in a pluralistic democracy where we are Christians and Jews and Muslims and non-believers and Hindus and Sikhs, it is an obligation on someone of faith whose views may well come out of their faith to make a case in terms that people who do not share their faith can understand. Oddly, Gary Bauer, the person who is supposed to be the guy well to Bush's right, gave a better answer to the same question. He too, at that point, everybody fell in line and named Jesus as their favorite political philosopher. But Gary Bauer sort of started reciting, I was hungry and you gave me to eat, I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. He gave some sort of substance to the original answer. The other part that's genuinely disturbing is the question of how much of this is pandering to a religious community. I mean, how much of this involves sort of stoking not the higher forms of religious commitment, but certain prejudices that people in any given religious community can have. That's not unique to Tom DeLay. It's not unique, or let me put it differently, it's not unique to the religious right. But I think that is something that can be genuinely disturbing. We could have two kinds of debates, two different sorts of debates over gay marriage in the coming year, and we are going to have a big national debate over this. And one could be what were your kind terms? Provocative but nuanced. And the other could get pretty hateful, and I think it would be much better to have the provocative and nuanced debate than the hateful sort of debate. And I think one of the challenges of talking about religion in public life is how do you make it about the first without veering too much into the second. And then, very last point. I always tell my conservative friends that I believe one of the most powerful conservative insights is the belief in original sin. Reinhold Niebuhr once said that original sin is the only empirically verifiable doctrine of the Christian church. That we are flawed creatures. And I always tell my conservative friends that they believe that except when it comes to tax cuts. And I cannot tell you how many times I've heard conservatives say that if only we cut taxes, people will have this money and they will become so much more generous toward the poor than they are now. So we're flawed and evil in every respect except under that circumstance when we will become the souls of generosity. So that, again, this is an argument, in a sense, within Christianity. I think that, it's fair enough for a Christian conservative to challenge me about what I think about family life, but I would challenge back about poverty. And I think that there is a healthy debate to be had where people can be out front about their religious convictions without cramming them down the throats of the whole country. Democrats have, I have Well, I commend you a piece by a friend of mine, a woman called Amy Sullivan, who used to work at the Pew Forum on religion and public life, is now getting a PhD at Princeton, and is also on the side working for Wesley Clark. And she wrote a wonderful piece for the Washington Monthly, I want to say within the last 6 months, which I think you can get online, on the Democrats' problem in talking about religion. And it's almost like a primer on how Democrats might begin to think about not sounding tongue-tied about religion. As I say, Bill Clinton was uniquely successful, paradoxically given some of the other problems he had, but was uniquely successful in talking about religion. A friend of mine at the Heritage Foundation, not Matt Spalding, but someone else, once said that, Clinton, more than any other Democrat he had seen in 20 years, actually understood the religious mind of America, including the mind of many religious conservatives. I mean, he was sort of marinated in the Southern Baptist tradition, and it was part of him. To me, a lot of it is about showing respect. I think that liberals, for some good and some not so good reasons, are against all kinds of prejudices, but wait till you hear them talk about, quotes, holy rollers or, quotes, religious fanatics. And so I do think that there are a lot of people of traditional views and fairly conservative religious views, so not necessarily right-wing political views, who are looking for the same kind of respect that Catholics once sought, or Jews sought, or African Americans sought, and that they sense a kind of disrespect that comes from liberals. So I do think, I think that's part of it. And so I say we should be against prejudice of all kinds, and one form of prejudice is to be prejudice against, say, Southern white Protestants. That is a form, that can be a form of prejudice in our society. On the other hand, I don't think any of that requires anyone to give up on their active defense of religious liberty. Indeed, I think that respect for people of other religious views is completely consistent with religious liberty. I mean, who was, one of the greatest voices in our history on behalf of religious liberty was a Baptist called Roger Williams up in New England. So I think that without losing a thing in defending religious liberty, I think showing sort of more respect and understanding for a different worldview and not just sort of writing it off as ignorant, as many liberals, you and I have both heard that happen in sort of discussions around dorms or dinner tables or whatever. I think that's the biggest part of the problem. That's a really thoughtful that's an extremely thoughtful observation. I think it's very important. I guess I take it on a number of different levels. I think in the first instance, why do people go to a church or a synagogue or a mosque? And in the first instance, it is not usually to find politics. I had a great personal example of this when I got married. The Catholic Church has what's called a prayer of the faithful in the middle of the Mass. And I wrote our prayer of the faithful. And one of my favorite experiences was sitting at the computer about 2 hours before our wedding took place, because my wife had said, this prayer of the faithful of yours sounds like a Democratic Party platform. You ought to change. I like most of it. I don't disagree with any of it, but this is a wedding service and a church service, and you might think about it. So I know where you're coming from. But most people don't go into church for that. They go into church for a relationship with God. They go into church to worship. They go into church to sort of look inside themselves as well as outside. And so I think there is a natural tension here. On the other hand, the church itself is one of the most powerful, church writ large, is one of the most powerful social institutions in our society. It's especially true of minority groups and groups discriminated against. Without the black church, there would not have been a civil rights movement, because in many parts of at the worst moments of the oppression of Jim Crow, the church was one of the only places where there was independent social action was possible. So church is also that. And then, in addition to that, there are, whatever you get out of the gospel, you got to get a concern for the poor. I don't see how you can read it anyway without seeing that that is a central concern of Jesus. A very conservative friend of mine who actually now works in the Bush administration once wrote a wonderful op-ed piece for the Washington Post where he said in the Bible, Jesus spoke about, and I forgot his list was something like abortion, same-sex marriage, something else, and the dangers of riches. And as he pointed out in this piece, the only one Jesus actually talked about were the dangers of riches. So I think one can make a perfectly plausible case there. I do think that there are times when the bureaucracies of churches get more and more distant and more ideological than the rank and file of the churches and then the people in the pews. I think that there has developed some distance between some of the national organizations and the way people in the pews think. And you've seen sometimes that's been reflected at national meetings where there are votes and votes against some of these positions. And so I think the challenge for a pastor such as the one sitting next to yours, next to you, is how does one balance the need to present, if you will, a prophetic message that challenges people to look into themselves and to consider what are their public and political obligations, and at the same time meet their genuine and completely honorable desire to see the church as primarily a spiritual place. I don't think the two are inconsistent, but I think a lot of times people sense that they are. They experience an inconsistency between those two things. Well, no, I think it's a problem of, first of all, we, as a country, we've been kind of inconsistent about this over a long period of time. We do not completely drive religious, a religious appreciation on public life. Congress is opened every day by a chaplain. They even had a bitter vote recently over what kind of chaplain it was going to be, and there were charges that some people were anti-Catholic or anti-this or anti-that. But there is a chaplain in the House. We do have "In God We Trust" on the currency. We have the debate over the addition back in the 1950s of "Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. And so we've had that inconsistency, and that's on the one side. On the other side, we really do not like the idea of the state imposing a particular religious view on people, which is why the Supreme Court ruled on school prayer as it did. And right now, even most religious conservatives who'd like some kind of reverence brought back into the public schools would settle for a moment of silence as opposed to a prescribed prayer, because a prescribed prayer, I think it was a problem either way. It was either contentless, in which case it disrespected every tradition, or it came from a particular tradition and was robust and therefore disrespected people who came out of the tradition that the prayer didn't represent. A problem with the Ten Commandments is not "thou shalt not kill," but some of the commandments about having, "thou shalt not have a false, strange god before me." What religion are we talking about? That the reason the court in Alabama ruled that this is inappropriate is because it was using public ground, public money, to celebrate a particular religious, view. Then you get into I think what is a genuinely complicated question. What do you do around times of religious celebration? What if you do put into a public arena, not only a creche, but also a menorah and something else to honor other religions? Are we better off to ban any use of public property for any religion, or are we better to open public property for, reasonable religious celebrations? And then what happens with private people? There was a very interesting controversy last week where the Reuters building in Times Square had denied the Methodist Church the right to run a 30-second ad, which was a pretty anodyne, if you've seen any of those Methodist ads on television, they're very open and welcoming. They're not sectarian. And they were denied the right to run their 30-second ad, and yesterday or the day before, the Reuters company reversed its decision and said, well, yes, you can run this ad. Now, that has nothing to do with the state. That's an independent decision. But if you think about people in the religious community who feel they get marginalized, I thought the Reuters ad was an interesting case in point. But I do think that you just, in a pluralistic society that respects the freedom of religion, you simply have to respect limits on what the state can do without, because if you don't respect those limits, I think all of us, in the United States is really now a nation entirely of minority religions. And so we want to respect the rights of all of those minorities, if not minority religions, certainly minority denominations. I guess I'd settle for a good president myself. Well, two things about Europe. Actually, the European case is interesting because I believe there is a strong welfare state in Europe, strong social provision for the poor, because there was actually an overlap between, if you will, the social democratic tradition and the Christian democratic tradition. That if you look at Christian democratic parties, for example, in Germany, this is a party that out of its Christian roots has a very strong commitment to public provision and has opposed a lot of cuts in public benefits over many years. A lot of sort of hardcore free market conservatives get very frustrated with the Christian democratic parties because they don't want to make the kind of cutbacks that a kind of more libertarian, somebody more libertarian would want to make. So I actually think that Europe is a complicated case because some of the Christian tradition reinforces parts of the, social democratic tradition, which is in a sense rooted, not always, but to some degree rooted in a Marxist tradition, that those two traditions on certain social welfare matters reinforce each other. The other interesting thing about Europe is Europe has never had as severe a separation of church and state as we have, and yet it is our very separation, I think, that has led, to some degree, has led all these religious communities to be much stronger. I think that one of the reasons Europe went the more secular direction is because perhaps for too long there was too close an association between the state and a particular church that kind of helped create a reaction and move towards secularism. And we never had that kind of reaction in the United States because from the beginning, certainly from the time of the Constitution, not necessarily from the beginning, but from the time of the Constitution, we didn't have that kind of state-church arrangement, especially at the national level. I guess it's part of what I was talking about earlier. I mean, the Bible Belt is such a complicated place and a complicated term because, one of the things that's always struck me is if you look at the Bible Belt and look at whites and blacks who are evangelical Christians, what's remarkable is how much of an overlap there is in the religious commitments and beliefs between white evangelical Christians and black evangelical Christians, and yet that has absolutely no translation into how they vote, because they vote almost diametrically opposed to each other. And so you have a case where racial division and racial conflict over a period of time has a much greater effect on political behavior than the people's religious beliefs. And that when you talk about the Bible Belt, you're really talking about the South, and the South is a place of enormous sort of sense of community and generosity, and it's a place that has a tradition where that's shaped by the terrible conflicts over race going back to the time of slavery, periods of time when there was a Ku Klux Klan. You cannot say that particular history characterizes either the entire South or explains Southern culture. And so I think, the term Bible Belt tends to be used in a negative way, but almost like any sort of decent culture I can think of, it's an ambiguous and complicated culture. And one final point on this. I've talked to a friend who's doing a lot of work on country music, His theory, from looking at some data, and he's trying to collect more data, is that people who are deep country music fans are different from people who are religious music fans, that the country fans are part of the South, part of the Bible Belt, yet not necessarily the believers in the same way, or more secularized than the people who listen to country music. I only use that as an example to say that's the danger I see in talking about the Bible Belt. The problem with the Bible Belt is you assume that the person who lives in the Bible Belt and holds the Bible will hit you over the head with it, and that's the image that it portrays. Eastern, by which you mean Islam, by Muslims? Mike Kinsley has a very interesting piece in Time magazine this week where it does seem to me that if someone is a devout believer and believes that their religion is true in some absolute sense, they must almost by definition believe that their religion is superior to another religion. And that I think at some intellectual level one has to accept that, because if they don't believe that, then what is the point of their particular faith? Now, I could turn around and say that there is a tradition of liberal theology that might assert, with St. Paul, that we all see through a glass darkly, and therefore we all have kind of an imperfect sense of who God is, and therefore we should join arms with our brothers and sisters in other religions and accept that we are sort of together trying to figure out and live by the truth of God. So if you hold a kind of liberal theology, you might sort of come easier to that sort of seemingly pluralistic view. The question is, can you say my religion is better than yours but not kill me because of it? And see, that's, I think, the issue. I think that at an intellectual level you simply have to respect the person whose faith is so profound that they are quite convinced that this set of beliefs really is superior. And we all, I think it's true of all of us. All of us believe that certain beliefs are superior to other beliefs. For some people it's religious, for some people it's political, for some people it may have to do with a feminist idea or with some philosophical idea. So then I think we all make choices just like that. We tend to hold it against the religious person. I think liberals tend to hold that choice more against the religious person. Yes, people have been killed in the name of religion. People have also been killed in the name of secular ideologies. So I think the rule is someone should be perfectly free to believe their religion is superior to someone else's, but don't kill other people because of it. And that's the sort of compromise we sort of groped toward from the 16th century forward, when we were sick and tired of wars of religion. The question was about the change in family politics, a change in the family structure, and how that will play out in politics, including the issue of gay marriage and civil unions and the like. Is that a fair rendition of the question? If you talk to pollsters, Democratic or Republican, I have found over and over again that they argue that the biggest change in the last 10 years is a change in attitudes toward gays and lesbians. That there's been a kind of sea change in terms of, ranging from sort of at least toleration to acceptance. And I think one reason for that is that simply so many people came out of the closet. And one of the major findings of the polls is, if you ask the question, do you have a friend or relative who is gay? People who answer yes to that question are overwhelmingly more sympathetic to gay rights. I always tell the story of my late mother, who was very religious and had a gay godson who was one of the most wonderful people she knew. And for her, the whole issue of gay rights became very personal, because when somebody said something nasty about a gay person, she thought about it in terms of this godson of hers, to the point where she called me up one day and we were talking, and I don't know if you know who I'm talking about, but she said, who is that lovely young man, Andrew Sullivan, I saw on television the other night? So I think there is that personal thing that's happened to a lot of people, regardless of their religious commitments, that comes from having more personal contact with people, awareness of personal friendship and relationship with people who are gay. So I think that's, and so therefore, that's the observation number one from the pollsters. Observation number two is a lot of people are uneasy about thinking about this issue. And so a conservative writer I know said that the side who raises an issue about gays loses, which is to say, somebody on the side of attacking people who are gay or lesbian, if you're seen on the attack, you lose because people don't like the intolerance represented by that. On the other side, if people push for, one more round of advance, whether it's, gay marriage is now the case, then voters might say, a certain chunk of voters would say, well, I don't really want to deal with that issue, please go away on that. And I think there is this sort of ambivalence out in the country about this. A huge change in terms of as I say, of acceptance and embrace, but still concerns about marriage. And the last thing is that the problem with marriage is, for many people, marriage is not a legal term, it's a sacramental term. And so the public debate about what the state should do to guarantee the rights of gay couples gets mixed up in the debate over people's sort of religious views about what constitutes marriage. Is marriage properly conceived of only as a sacrament for men and women? In terms of the family as a whole, I think we're going through a very, I don't think all of this goes in one direction. I think that people have become not so much more conservative, but I think there is a realization that, just at the level of social science, that intact families, where there are two parents present, are on balance better for kids than the alternatives. Not universally true, not always the case, just the statistical averages. Senator Moynihan got into a lot of trouble when he said this back in 1965, but broadly speaking, that's true. And so I think what you have is a moment, best characterized by my friend Bill Galston, who's a philosopher at the University of Maryland, and he said most Americans can be called tolerant traditionalists, and that we have some tug toward, it's kind of like it's a flip side of flexidoxy, that we have a tug toward certain traditional structures, not defined necessarily as, women staying home with the children, but marriage, intact family, the importance of it, and yet have a deep desire to be accepting and a knowledge that that societies change and adjust and people have to adjust to them. And so I think politically, the politician who understands this dynamic of tolerant traditionalism is the politician who is going to speak to the largest number of Americans. I want to thank you all very, very much for coming tonight. Thank you. Thank you.